Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Nicolas Vachicouras, and he is the CEO and founder of Neurosoft Bio, which basically uses the technology out of EPFL and Dr. Stephanie Lacour's lab, which is very, very soft neural implants, basically silicon-based electrodes. And they're using it to make ECOG arrays. And they're so soft, in fact, that you don't have to do major brain surgery. You can actually just drill a borehole into the skull and kind of wrap it up and then put it in and unwrap it inside on top of the brain. And so this really reduces the risk for these ECOG arrays. Very, very interesting stuff. They were kind of around for a few years now, kind of built up or held up by business plan competitions, but now they're actually raising money. So we talk a little bit about that. And all out of Switzerland. So we also talk about the benefits, the pros and the cons of starting out in Switzerland. Anyways, very interesting conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Nicolas Vachicouras, pleasure to have you on the show. You are from Neurosoft Bio, and you were you have a PhD from EPFL in the Stephanie Lacour lab. So we were just talking about this right before we started recording in the field of neuroprosthetics. And basically the emphasis over there is soft implants, basically not having silicon implants like with the BlackRock Utah electrode array, but having polyimide and other soft materials. So introduced you a little bit, but do you want to talk a little bit about yourself and your work and Neurosoft as well?
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a pleasure having to talk to you. So basically, I'm an engineer, so I did my studies at EPFL, so in Lausanne, in Switzerland. And actually, when I started, my goal was really to go into neural interfaces. Actually, my big dream was to do a bionic eye. And pretty much when I finished my bachelor's degree, I was looking for a lab that was as close as possible to that. And I met Stephanie Lacour. I did my bachelor's, and this is where we started working together on these soft neural interfaces. And then I moved on with my master thesis. We were working also with other labs there with Grégoire Courtine on spinal cord stimulation for spinal cord injury. And then I did 1 year in Boston at Harvard Med School, where I learned a bit about the surgery parts and doing more animal experimentation, but that was not my thing. I went back to microengineering and decided to do a PhD with Stephanie for 4 years. And from the beginning, the goal was really to use this as 4 years of R&D to really develop the technology to spin off a startup company that we started 2 years ago. And so as soon as I finished my PhD in 2019, I started working full-time on the startup to basically bring these technologies from her lab to, from preclinical models to the clinic. So that's really the kind of the story in a gist, yeah.
Wow. So from right at the beginning of the PhD, you're like, I want to spin this off. I want to make this into a technology that more people, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it was, I think someone had told me that it's important to, as soon as you know where you want to go, the earlier the better.
Yeah, that's really impressive. I mean, I guess that is kind of my my thrust as well. I'm really interested in the spin-off and startup stuff and everything like this, and I really like this bench to bedside. You take something that's been played around with in the lab and everything like this, and try to make it into a commercializable product. So basically, it's a ECOG, like a electrocortical device that you put on top of the brain, and it kind of conforms to the surface of the brain better than something made out of silicon or something like this, right? Is that pretty much what it is, or do you want to describe it a little bit better?
Yeah, so actually at the very beginning, the technology was really very, very versatile. So actually we started with spinal cord stimulation. So we really designed the devices to go on the spinal cord and subdurally. And then we also started doing other projects and, of course, going towards the brain and even peripheral nerves. To be honest, we've looked at a lot of different applications. And for now, with the company, the first product is going to be exactly for ECOG, so really conforming to the brain. But we know that there's possibility of using this interface for interfacing with pretty much any kind of neural tissue, and even beyond that. I mean, we've even considered the heart at one point, for example. So it's a very generic technology. Yeah.
Sounds good. So yeah, do you want to talk about first of all? I mean, we talk a lot about it on the show, but what's the benefit of soft versus hard implants?
Yeah, that's a classic question. So basically, for us, it's a few things. So first of all, as you say, so you presented before polyimide. So we consider like three levels of rigidity, and the main metric is Young modulus and also the thickness. So basically, the bending stiffness of the entire device. And so we consider like silicon, like the Utah ray at the most extreme case of rigid. Then in between, we talk more about flexible electronics. So basically, some like plastics, like polyimide that you can bend but not stretched. And then when we talk about soft, we're thinking more about really stretchable electrodes and elastic. So we're talking about elastic moduli around 1 megapascal and below. So that's what we consider as soft. And so for us, it's important for two reasons. First of all, as you said before, it allows us to conform very nicely to the complex curvature. And sometimes you have structures like cylinders that you can actually very nicely fold with even a piece of plastic. But if you start having complex structures like on the brain, sulci that are like a cavity, and then it's folding in another direction, you have multiple bending radii, and this is where softness is really important to be able to actually conform to these complex curvatures and like a sphere basically. So that's one aspect. And the other aspect, and we were quite surprised, but we've observed that in preliminary animal studies, both on the spinal cord of monkeys and on the brain of pigs for up to 6 months implantation. But we really saw minimized scar tissue around the electrodes compared to more rigid electrodes. And so we think that softness is not only about being able to conform, but also being able to reduce the foreign body reaction. And so, of course, this will need more work to see really how this performs on the very, very long term. But we think it's also a key on that aspect, and I think that's why we're actually very excited about using soft materials. And as you know, a lot of people have been trying to do this more at the cellular level, where they grow cells on softer and softer substrates, and showing that cells prefer softer substrates. And I think that's kind of the effects we also see in the body. So these are really the main points about soft electrodes that we think are important.
Is that foreign body response something that happens in ECOG as well? Like the kind of plastic stiffness materials, does the body react poorly to that?
So what we've seen from literature is really these typical big metal discs that are embedded in a relatively stiff silicone. So from what the pictures that I've seen in literature, yeah, you have a lot of scar tissue, fibrotic tissue that is created around it. And this was mostly from studies in monkeys. And we've actually also talked to some neurosurgeons that observed that also in humans. Even after a few weeks, they can start seeing fibrotic tissue around these type of devices. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, very cool. So what's the, I guess, fabrication methods, materials, how, I mean, if people had to imagine this, how stiff is it? Like how can they kind of imagine this in their minds?
I think thinking of what is like,
I guess on their minds eventually, or on their brains,
yeah, on their
which is
brains, exactly. Now I'm trying to think what is the closest thing you would have at home that you could try to understand how elastic it is. It's like rubber, I don't know if I cannot think of an actual product, but rubber is in people's mind, I guess, something that you can relate to. So basically it's nice because it allows you to have flexibility, but because the elastic modulus is relatively low compared to polyimide. For example, polyimide is at 1 gigapascal. Silicone that we're using is 1 megapascal, so like 3 orders of magnitude. So it actually allows you to make them thicker, but keep the same type of what we call bending stiffness. So really allowing you to have the same type of flexibility, which is actually quite nice to be able to manipulate it. So I actually have it on video, but you cannot see it really. But it's kind of these.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah,
Yeah.
it looks very floppy. It looks like a it would conform to a brain pretty easily, I guess.
Exactly.
And the benefit, I guess, with the thickness of it too is it's easy to be manipulatable, like handleable by the surgeon and everything like this. That's a big issue. Sometimes these things get very, very small.
Exactly. So that's one of the points we try to make about using silicones. It's that it allows you to avoid having this issue, because to do the equivalent type of flexibility with polyimide, you need to make it like 8 microns or below in thickness. And then these films are very, very hard to manipulate. I mean, they would, just with static electricity, they would just fold on top of each other. So that's kind of the issue that we don't really have. So that's what we like about having low young modulus devices.
Yeah, definitely. I experienced this in the lab as well. Is just like a little bit of static electricity and boom, it comes together. Or,
Exactly.
that could ruin a device. And if you're in the surgical theater, then that might be very very unpleasant. You have to go get
Exactly.
another one or something.
Yeah.
So your guys' device also, I'm reading here, doesn't have MRI artifacts. What is that? How is that? And why is that important?
Yes, I think that's a lot of people have observed that I would say in general in thin film electronics, because until now you had these, relatively thick metal discs, in a few microns, and these generate usually a huge artifact because they interact with the MRI field, and they also, could potentially heat up or start moving. And so what we've observed, and we're not the only ones, but basically we're using very thin films of metals, like, below 1 micron, even hundreds of nanometers, then you have much less interaction with the MRI field. And this, so it's not only about having something that is not going to move or heat up, but also it doesn't generate any kind of, these shadows around the brain at the electrode level. And that's actually, very nice to have if you want to make sure you don't have, for example, subdural hematomas, or if you didn't damage the brain, you can actually image the brain perfectly well at the electrode level.
Yeah, exactly. And that was something, I had heard before, different products. I'm just like, well, what's the big deal? I mean, like, I haven't gotten many MRIs, but once you have something like this implanted, then, your chances of getting an MRI and having, like you said, kind of these issues later on, subdural hematoma, like, it's higher. So it actually is very, very important.
No, it's important. And then for some applications, for example, when they use these electrodes for epilepsy mapping, they ideally they would like to be able to do MRI so they can see where is the brain with respect to the electrodes that even could have moved. And today, what they have to do is, kind of take MRIs from before the surgery and try to so they can do CT scans afterwards. And sometimes you also have artifacts there, and then try to guess what would be the movement of the brain afterwards, and try to, kind of map with images from before the surgery, which is not exactly after the surgery, because, sometimes the brain moves along as you do a craniotomy, so it makes it much easier. For example, for epilepsy, I think it's a great advantage. But in very general, matter, you have risks when you do neurosurgery, and you want to be able to go there and check that everything is fine at the brain level.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in carpentry, they say measure twice, cut once. But I guess if you can only measure once, and then you have to wait a few months or something like this, it's just like that doesn't sound like it's going to end up well.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about this process of going again the bench bedside, like spinning off the company. What was this like? And then I mean, you're based in Switzerland, or it was originally in Switzerland, and so how was that different compared to other places? There's not many neurotech companies from Switzerland, right?
No, there's not. I think there's a more and more coming up in general in the US and in Europe, but not that many. So it's been a very interesting adventure. So we are quite lucky in Switzerland, I have to say, because we get a lot of help from the government, and also at EPFL, at least, they've put a lot of incentives for people like myself, who are basically developing new technologies during a PhD and want to use this to, spin off an actual company that can actually, benefit society by the work you've done. So we were quite lucky, so to find very quickly some non-dilutive funding, as we call it, so grants, to basically, I was employed as a postdoc pretty much for 2 years in Stephanie Lacour's laboratory, but I could focus 100% on the startup company. So you don't have any, responsibilities in terms of teaching or publishing. You can really focus on your business case, and that's really expected by the funding mechanisms that you have around. So that's something very nice. And we were also quite lucky because at the same time, that's actually one of the reasons I came back from the US after my master thesis. There was a big decision: should I stay, in Boston area, or should I go back to Switzerland? And back then, there was an institute being put in place, which is the Wyss Center, which is an initiative, a private foundation that its goal is to really, help bringing technologies from neural interfaces or neurotech from the bench to the clinic, and they were actually being implanted just next door to us at the campus biotech in Geneva. So for me, I was like, there's this nice opportunity, there's money coming in, there is the environment, and actually they helped a lot. So a lot of the funding we had very early on came from them, also through the lab. And that was a great way to set up, especially the manufacturing, because as you can imagine, it's all in the clean room. It requires special equipment, and we wanted to make sure that we don't have any cross-contamination with researchers, which is always one of the critical aspects when you try to do like good manufacturing practices. You want something that is really separate from people who are testing crazy materials. So, voilà.
Yeah, definitely. I can imagine. I mean, yeah, researchers really destroy, especially those in training, really destroy tools and everything like this.
Yeah.
So that is actually really interesting because you have seen both sides of it. You've seen, I guess the Swiss side and, the American or, Boston side. And how would you compare and contrast those?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities, and then there's also big differences. It's true that one thing that I really like about this, so I'm also, to be completely disclosed, for full disclosure, I'm also American. My dad is from New York, and I went more than often in the US. And what I like there, and I really felt it a lot when I was there, there's a lot of ambition and people who are aiming, very, very high. And whereas in Switzerland, it's true that a lot of people have, I would say, they're a bit more like risk adverse. So that was one of the big differences I had seen, and I still see now. As you're fundraising, it's a big difference with the investors in Europe versus Americans who ask you, "Am I going to drive my Tesla in 10 years with my brain?" That's not the questions you get from Swiss German people.
What are the questions they give?
No, it's more down to earth. How are we gonna how are we going to generate any revenues in the next few years, and what is your business model for the next 4 or 5 years, whereas in the US they're much more on the long term, big vision. So I saw that also, at the level of investors now, but I also saw it back then, at the level of the people and the people who are much more motivated to work. But I find that this is also coming up more and more here in Europe, and I think it's also because universities like EPFL are really pushing innovation, pushing people to take risks. And I think in the US, people have this mentality of failing is not an issue. Failing is part of everyday life. And it's true that in Switzerland, people view these things very differently. And I have to say, 10 years ago, doing a startup company was not, so, viewed as nicely as today, where people, like, okay, doing a startup, a lot of people are doing that. That was not the case 10 years ago. And, people would expect you to get a job in a good company and just move forward. So things are changing, I have to say, but these are the type of mentalities you still see some, reminiscence of these things still today.
Yeah, no, I had the same experience in Germany, out of I don't know, the 80 or so in our cohort, in the, all the sister master's programs and everything like this. I was the only one that was like, oh, I want to do, entrepreneurship. And it was very much different, and it was everybody there. They kind of wanted to go work for a big company and just stay there for the rest of their lives. So it is very strange. So yeah, that was 7 years ago. So I wonder if it has changed since then. But it's similar to hear that it's so similar in Switzerland.
And I also asked myself why. And I think one of the things, which is maybe it's wrong, but I feel like also the quality of life, at least here in Switzerland, is very, very high in general. And it's true that when everything is so perfect, you have the mountains, you can go hiking. Why? You have pretty good quality of life. Why push yourself? And I think that's what I see a lot. Whereas I think, when you start more from the bottom, you have this drive to move higher up. And I think that's one of the big differences also with the US, depending on where you are with respect to countries like Switzerland.
Yeah, definitely. You're much more hungry. You're much more aggressive,
Exactly.
to get more resources and everything like this. And that's why I guess a lot of immigrants, start a lot of companies and they're successful with it too.
Yeah.
So you guys have been very successful with a lot of, I don't know, competitions and these kind of grants and everything like that. Do you want to talk a little bit about this as well?
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, that's really how we actually were able for 2 years to pretty much move forward with the funding. So that really helped. And it also helps to create contacts, to meet new people, to get ourselves known. And for me, I know that one of the big challenges in this field, and I think that's something I really appreciate about Neuralink, which I think they understood this, is hiring. You're going to have trouble finding the right people. And I think it's important to, get yourself known, also for investors, but also eventually, once you start hiring, when you have the money, it's going to be a big challenge. And if you look at what Neuralink is doing, a lot is stunts to attract people. That's the sole purpose. And maybe it's distracting them, but I think they understood that this is going to be one of the main challenges. And for us, that's kind of the same logic we had. We said, let's try to do as much as we can in terms of public relations, because we know that if you want to make this work, you're going to need the brightest minds. It's not a type of problem where you just throw money at it. It's not going to solve it. Yeah. So
yeah, definitely. I mean, that's, getting talent and getting, the right person can definitely speed things along, like, 3 times, 5 times, something like this. And it's amazing. So you guys are a little bit more further along past that. I mean, I do kind of see that, that phase in a company's life, like applying for grants and applying, not necessarily grants, but applying for competitions and everything like that. That is very early stage. So you guys have grown beyond that now, maybe putting on, taking off the diapers and into big boy pants, something like this. What are you guys up to now? You guys have raised money, right?
So actually we're in the process of doing our first equity round. So we're in talks with some investors, especially here in Europe, and we hope to close a round in the upcoming months. So it's not easy. And one of the things I was really surprised is, a lot of people say they do medtech, but when you tell them we're doing implantable devices, it's a whole new game. And, I was surprised to hear some, VCs who, are investing in medtech, and they tell you, you know what, we don't do implantable that much. I was like, oh, okay, what do you do? But then I realized there's a lot of medical devices that are not implantable. And it's hard to also find the people who have the expertise in-house to judge what we do. Because, neurotech is not as advanced as if you look at cardiology, for example, there's much more. So it is a challenge to find the right people who have the expertise in-house, especially on the investor level, and also that, are willing to take the risk with a, high risk device. So that's where we're at now. Yeah, we're fundraising.
Yeah, definitely. It's a very difficult thing. Like, and the people who do the wearable devices are different. Sorry, the investors who do that are different than the ones who do implantable. And like you said, that is a very small group of people. It's not like it's a very high risk profile, and it takes a long time to get to market and everything like this. So it can be very difficult.
Yeah, I knew that medtech was a thing in itself, but then I realized implantable within medtech is another very small niche, and that's what I was not expecting.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so once you guys get this money, you guys are going to turn it into products. What are some kind of next steps or plans for the future?
Yeah, so we have a kind of 2-step approach that a lot of companies in our field who are developing completely new technologies have also taken. I think it makes a lot of sense, is to start typically with subdural electrodes. So these are these devices that are aimed for implantation for a maximum of 30 days. So it's a really nice way to get started, because you have a nice regulatory pathway, especially in the US, to go through a 510K clearance, and especially that it's considered a class 2 medical device in the US. So that's a big difference. You have different criteria to rank devices. So in Europe, it's really about where do you put it. So if it's on the brain, it's class 3 directly. In the US, there's also this temporal aspect. And because you're inserting it on the brain for less than 30 days, it's considered a class 2. And this actually can help you speed up market entry. So we're starting with these devices, and that's really our goal now. And hopefully next year, we are aiming for a 510K clearance, and we're really working on this on the upcoming 12 months. And that's really our number one objective, to get a device on the market, and to also show that we're capable of, getting the entire route really from the research to the market. And then we're actually thinking of, and we're also working on it now, on a fully implantable system that will be chronically implanted for 10, 20 years. And this is the more like mid/long-term kind of goal that we have in the company.
Yeah, very cool. And then you guys had going back to this class 2, class 3. Yeah. I mean, that is interesting to hear. But you guys had an interesting implantation mechanism too. Now I'm thinking about it, and because of you're utilizing such a soft device. Do you want to talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, so we're still working on it. But one of the third advantage of having soft, in addition to the benefits once it's implanted, is that really you can fold these devices in very extreme ways. You can pinch them, and because actually they're not plastic, they don't deform plastically, they don't kink like you would have a piece of paper. So we thought we should really leverage that because it allows you to do some minimally invasive surgeries where you can basically fold the electrode in a very extreme ways, for example, through a burr hole and then deploy them. And so we're currently working on tools to basically facilitate this type of deployment. And this is really also taking fully advantage of the stretchability and softness of the electrodes during surgery. Actually, a lot of people ask me, do you need stretchability once it's in the body? And I would say not really, maybe on the spinal cord, but on the brain, not that much. But it's really where we expect the most mechanical stresses to occur is during the surgery. I mean, I don't know if you've seen a neurosurgeon manipulate a device, but it's not friendly.
I can imagine it's pretty rough.
Yeah. So voila.
But yeah, that is really interesting because it's a much smaller ask to be like, hey, let me drill a burr hole in your skull, and then it's the size of a needle or something like this, versus like I'm going to remove a huge section of skull and skin and everything like this. Your brain's going to be exposed to air.
Yeah.
So I think that is really interesting, and then I guess that's a very I guess novel way of going at it, and I haven't really seen this too often. It should be taken advantage of.
Because, at least in the context of epilepsy, one of the big trends now is to move away from these subdural electrodes and actually go with deep brain probes, so what they call SEEG, so steroid EEG. And one of the main reasons when we talk to surgeons is not because it's better, it's because it's safer. It's really because you just drill a small hole, patient recovery is so much faster. Also aesthetically, as you said, you don't have a huge hole in your skull. So that's much, much better for many reasons. So for us, it's try to get the best of the two worlds where you can actually map the cortex, but also having a minimally invasive kind of approach. So that's kind of one of our big goals with this first approach. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really cool. I think it's the way it should be done, honestly.
Yeah.
And then you guys also have the spinal cord stimulators, or you're also looking into going into this. Do you want to describe that? And then I guess how much movement? I was very surprised. I saw your talk at the Bioelectronic Medicine Forum put on by Neurotech Reports, and I was surprised how much the brain moves, how much neural tissue can deform, and even just talking and swallowing and everything like this, how much it moves. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, no. So actually, that's a video that we often show. So it's actually a MRI that it's been, the movement is exaggerated, so it's an amplified movement. But indeed, you breathe all the time. You have blood circulating. You have the CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, circulating. So we call it at the brain level more of a macromotion. And again, I think that's been really one of the struggles, especially for penetrating electrodes. When you have, imagine panna cotta, you put a needle and then you shake it a little bit for 20 years, and you can imagine that's not a great thing for the brain. So, and we think that it's also important even if you have something at the surface. So that's really what we call the macromotion. So yeah, we expect this to, and friction, constant friction between something soft and rigid, even if it's moving a little bit for a very long period of time, we don't think it helps. And on the spinal cord, I think, it's quite self-explanatory, but you have much more movement. For example, if you think at the cervical level, depending on how you implant your device, you could have compression of the spine itself. So to be honest, today we're not really looking into spinal cord devices per se. We're more focusing on the brain, because one thing we've learned, which is very frustrating as a scientist and engineer, is that you cannot do everything. So you have to focus. I think focus is the name of the game when you do a startup company. So for now, we're really focusing on the brain to also demonstrate, that the technology works implanted. But of course, we always think of the spinal cord, also because that was one of the first devices that we have developed at the research level.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good idea, and you have that potential later on, and once you're a little bit more established, I think that's a really good idea. Yeah, this is really cool. I mean, I'm really enjoying this. I love to see companies kind of form out of this and not necessarily die with the PhD thesis, and that they go work for a big company.
No, exactly. I mean, for us, it's it's always frustrating when you see all these cool technologies. It becomes a Nature paper, science paper, and then you don't hear about it again. And actually, that's something that I really appreciate in our lab. Stephanie Lacour really pushed this technology, for a very long time, because, and that's also kind of the mentality of, I would say, Thomas Stiglitz, with Cortec, which is, it's not only about doing something cool, but doing something reliably with a high yield. And this takes time. So of course, it's not very sexy when you look at science, because you're like, yeah, you showed this 5 years ago. Who cares about your searchable gold? But actually bringing it to the level where it's actually, helping people, which is, I think, should be the goal for all these devices. It takes a long time, and finding people, like Thomas Chiglis or Stephanie Lacour, who really see the value of that and who are willing to put in the effort at the academic level to, increase reliability, work on connectors. No one wants to work on connectors. We spent a lot of time on that. And that's, I think, also, we were lucky to be in that environment where you have a PI who really wants to, push the technology and, understand what it takes to bring it to humans. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's funny you mentioned the connectors because I'm also working on connectors here at University of Florida, and yeah, it's not very sexy. It's just kind of like it's like a USB plug, and so what's why are you guys spending so much time on it? But you're absolutely right. It's very, very difficult, and sometimes it's not so flashy, but it needs to be done.
Yeah, I mean, it's the main bottleneck in the industry. It's very easy when you do MEMS. I come from the micro nanotechnology. It's very easy to do very, very small things that work great. And then once you have to connect it to the external world, you're like, okay, how do I do that? So that's the same problem for every device, not only neural interfaces, to be honest.
Exactly, and especially trying to connect thousands of devices, or thousands of channels, thousands of things, and
exactly.
And again, back to the surgeon handleability. It's like you can't do that. You can't do that with your hands.
Exactly.
Yeah. Cool, Nicholas. This has been a pleasure. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
No, I mean, I think for us, it's really been a great adventure, and we're really excited about, we're actually very happy to see all these companies growing up now and coming into the field. I think it really helps to, have people know about our field and better understand BCIs and brain computer interfaces, neural interfaces. And I think there's a lot that's going to be happening in the upcoming months, and we're really happy to be part of that. And I think we all have different technologies, different approaches, and we really believe that soft is going to be a critical point if you want to have these devices to work on for a long time in the body. And so that's how we position ourselves at Neurosoft.
Excellent. Yeah, I agree with that thesis. So yeah, thank you very much.
No, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.